$1.4 trillion. This represents the amount developing countries spent solely on foreign debt interest during 2023. This wasn't paying down their actual obligations, just the interest charges. $1.4 trillion moved from Earth's most impoverished nations straight into the coffers of creditors operating out of Washington, London, and Paris. This sum exceeds Spain's complete GDP. It surpasses Australia's entire economic output. And this covers merely 1 year's interest obligations. But the truly catastrophic aspect is this. Every dollar that enters the developing world as aid sees $14 exit through undervalued exports, inflated imports, and corporate profits sent abroad. Consider that ratio again. $1 flows in, $14 flows out. This isn't assistance, it's extraction. This isn't development aid, it's organized wealth transfer at an unprecedented historical scale. Across the last 60 years, this apparatus has siphoned $62 trillion away from impoverished and developing countries into first-world financial institutions and corporations. $62 trillion. This exceeds the United States and China's combined economic output. It's almost twice the planet's total debt. And this extraction happened systematically, lawfully, via a structure most people never learn about, yet it governs the economic destiny of 152 nations. This structure goes by the name International Monetary Fund. Over the coming 25 minutes, I'll demonstrate precisely how the IMF's debt mechanism operates, explain why it represents the most powerful colonization instrument ever created, reveal how it's devastated entire continents, and most alarmingly, explain why America is currently heading into the identical trap that's held the developing world captive for 6 decades. This isn't merely about Africa, Latin America, or Asia now. This concerns American economic independence reaching its end, and we're looking at a 5 to 10-year time frame. Let me begin by illustrating the actual scale of current events, because most individuals lack awareness of how severe the extraction has grown. The developing world presently carries $31 trillion in total obligations. You might consider this modest. After all, the U.S. alone holds $38 trillion in debt. But here lies the crucial difference. The United States borrows in currency it creates itself. We possess the ability to inflate our obligations away. We command the Federal Reserve. We determine our monetary policy independently. Developing countries lack this privilege. They borrow in dollars, euros, or yen, currencies beyond their control. When payment becomes impossible, they forfeit everything. Currently, nearly 60% of low-income nations exist in debt distress. This technical designation means they're fighting to fulfill debt requirements and face imminent default or have defaulted already. 60%. This isn't a handful of exceptions, it's the majority of Earth's poorest countries ensnared in impossible debt. And here's where mathematics becomes absurd. Numerous governments now allocate more funds toward interest payments to foreign creditors than toward healthcare, education, and infrastructure combined. Let me present an actual case so you grasp the mechanics. Zambia. From 2018 through 2021, just 3 years, Zambia's debt payments leaped from 20% of national expenditure to 38%. During this identical period, healthcare funding decreased from 9.5% to 8%. Education funding plummeted from 17% in 2016 to merely 12% in 2022. Consider the implications. In 2022, Zambia devoted 38% of its complete budget to interest payments to foreign financial institutions, while allocating only 12% towards educating its youth. The nation is genuinely sacrificing its future for creditor payments. This isn't an isolated case. This pattern repeats across dozens of nations trapped within IMF arrangements. Reduce education spending, reduce healthcare spending, reduce infrastructure investment, service the debt. Always service the debt. Failure to comply results in IMF cutting international credit market access, currency collapse, and economic implosion. Countries possess no alternative but compliance.
This represents economic enslavement conducted via a spreadsheet. Now let me reveal who actually controls this apparatus. Understanding the power hierarchy reveals everything.
The IMF encompasses 190 member nations, nearly every country globally, yet voting authority isn't distributed fairly. Far from it. The United States alone possesses veto authority over all major IMF decisions. One nation among 190 can block anything. Overall, the global north, wealthy industrialized countries, commands 9 times the voting strength of the global south combined. 9 times. While the IMF portrays itself as a global institution, a neutral mediator assisting countries facing crisis, it actually functions as a boardroom dominated by Earth's wealthiest economies, making determinations that serve their interests while harming everyone else. Here's evidence the system operates with bias. For 65 years, every single managing director has originated from Western Europe, not Africa, not Asia, not Latin America, Europe, consistently. For 65 years, the institution controlling 152 developing nations' economic fate has never had leadership from a developing nation. This isn't coincidence, it's intentional design. Now let me explain how the debt trap actually functions. Once you understand the mechanism, you'll recognize why escape is nearly impossible. The pattern proceeds through 5 stages, repeated over 100 countries with virtually identical outcomes every time. Stage 1, the crisis hook. You cannot trap a healthy, stable nation with debt. They don't require borrowing, so you await crisis. War, natural catastrophe, economic meltdown, political turmoil, commodity price collapse. When a country faces desperation and collapse, that's when you extend the loan. The IMF doesn't manufacture the crisis, they simply wait. When it arrives, they present themselves as the sole salvation. The country drowns. The IMF throws a rope, but the rope carries a noose. Stage 2, the conditional loan. The IMF provides emergency financing to stabilize crisis, but loans arrive with conditions, extensive conditions. They label it conditionality. It sounds technical and sensible. Actually, it's a takeover blueprint. To receive the loan, the country must consent to slash government expenditure, particularly social programs, increase taxes to guarantee debt repayment, eliminate subsidies on food, fuel, and necessities, privatize state-owned industries for sale to foreign corporations, open markets to foreign imports while removing local industry protections, devalue currency to reduce export costs and increase foreign exchange, restructure taxation to prioritize debt service over public services. These aren't recommendations, they're mandates. Country refuses any condition, loan gets denied, and without that loan, immediate economic collapse. So governments sign. They have no choice. Stage 3, the austerity spiral. Once the country accepts IMF conditions and receives funding, genuine destruction begins. Government spending gets slashed, public sector employees get terminated, food and fuel subsidies vanish, causing price spikes. Schools and hospitals lose funding. State-owned enterprises, frequently the economy's most profitable segments, get sold to foreign corporations at bargain prices. And the economy doesn't recover, it deteriorates. Independent assessments discovered that countries under IMF programs grew on average 1.5 percentage points beneath the IMF's own projections in the first year. Let me repeat, the IMF's own programs cause economies to contract more severely than even IMF predictions. That's not rescue, that's sabotage. As the economy contracts, tax collection falls, unemployment climbs, poverty expands, and the government, now with reduced revenue and increased problems, cannot meet debt obligations. So what occurs? They return to the IMF for additional loans.
Stage 4, the dependency trap. This is where the trap fully closes. The country becomes dependent on IMF loans. They accept new loans to service interest on previous loans. It's a Ponzi scheme. Each new loan brings additional conditions, more privatizations, more reductions, more foreign control. The IMF distributes loans in tranches. Money arrives in installments. To receive the subsequent installment, the country must achieve specific IMF-established targets. Missing a target freezes the next payment. When the IMF freezes payment, international investors panic, currency crashes, economy implodes, so governments execute whatever the IMF demands to maintain money flow. They forfeit control over their economic policy. The IMF dictates spending limits, taxation levels, which industries to privatize, which laws to modify. The government becomes a puppet. The IMF manipulates the strings. The country remains trapped in what economists term perpetual debt distress. They can never eliminate the debt. They can never escape IMF supervision. They're a sovereign nation on paper, a debt colony in reality. Stage 5. The permanent extraction. Once a country locks into the dependency trap, extraction begins earnestly and never ceases. Let me present Africa's numbers, where extraction appears most visible and devastating. Every single year, $88.6 billion exits Africa through capital flight. That's nearly 4% of the continent's complete GDP. Vanished, not invested in roads, schools, or hospitals, extracted and transferred to financial institutions in London, New York, and Paris. That's $88.6 billion annually that could reconstruct infrastructure, finance education, develop industries. Instead, it flows outward as loan repayments, repatriated profits, and illicit financial transfers. This has continued for decades. Across the past 60 years, $62 trillion has drained from the developing world into wealthy nations. For perspective, that exceeds what the entire global economy generates in 1 year. That's generational wealth permanently gone. The consequences are catastrophic. From 1979 to 1992, Africa's GDP increased less than 1% total across 13 years, not annually, total. 13 years of IMF reforms, and the continent's economy essentially froze. Investment collapsed, factories closed. Africa's portion of world exports fell by over half. In 1970, Africa supplied over 20% of the developing world's agricultural exports. By 1990, that dropped to merely 8%. Manufacturing collapsed worse, from nearly 8% of developing world exports to just over 1%. Let me clarify what this signifies. Africa underwent deindustrialization. The continent regressed, and this happened under IMF supervision. Programs supposedly creating growth instead destroyed entire industries. Here's the most brutal irony. Twice as many Africans live in absolute poverty today in raw numbers compared to 1980. 40 years of IMF programs, billions in loans, endless reforms, and poverty doubled. That's not failure, that's intentional. Because the IMF was never designed to develop Africa. It was designed to maintain Africa as a cheap resource source and captive market for Western products. Now let me demonstrate how this operates practically with specific examples, because the pattern remains identical across continents. Zambia. During the 2000s, under IMF pressure, Zambia privatized its copper mines, the national economy's lifeblood. The promise included efficiency and foreign investment. Reality brought unemployment, lost revenue, and foreign corporations extracting wealth. The mines sold for a fraction of actual value to multinational corporations, receiving tax exemptions and profit guarantees. Zambia, once the world's third-largest copper producer, ended up earning less from copper exports than Chile, despite similar output. Why? Because profits flowed overseas. Corporations extracted copper, paid minimal taxes, sent profits to shareholders in London and Toronto. Zambia received the hole in the ground. The West received the wealth. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Western economists and the IMF promoted something called shock therapy. The concept involved transitioning from communism to capitalism overnight, privatize everything, remove price controls, open markets to foreign competition immediately. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin implemented the plan. The outcome was modern peacetime history's most catastrophic economic collapse. Prices exploded 2,500% during the first year, while wages remained frozen. Life savings evaporated overnight. Poverty went from essentially zero under the Soviet system to over 40% of the population. Life expectancy dropped 6 years. Entire industries collapsed. Unemployment skyrocketed. While the economy burned, a small group of men, many with Western bank connections, purchased state assets for pennies. Oil companies, gas monopolies, steel plants, banks, all sold at absurd discounts. That's how Russian oligarchs emerged, not through entrepreneurship, but through IMF-backed privatization schemes, transferring Soviet state wealth to private hands in history's largest robbery. The pattern continues. Argentina followed the identical script during the 1990s, privatized industries under IMF guidance. For several years, money poured in. Then, in 2001, economic collapse. Banks froze accounts, currency crashed, unemployment reached 25%, millions descended into poverty, all under IMF supervision. Let me now explain why this matters to you as an American right now in 2026. Because the identical debt trap mechanism that destroyed the developing world is being deployed against the United States, and most Americans remain completely unaware. The U.S. national debt stands at $38 trillion. Debt to GDP ratio, 128%. We're 2 percentage points from the 130% threshold, where every empire throughout history has faced systemic crisis. We're paying $1.2 trillion annually in interest, over 20% of federal revenue. This percentage rises exponentially as old debt gets refinanced at higher rates. We're in stage 3 of the debt trap, the austerity spiral. We haven't reached IMF control yet, but we're following the exact mathematical pattern, borrowing new money to service interest on old debt, running $2 trillion annual deficits with no reduction plan, watching interest costs devour the budget while infrastructure crumbles and social programs face cuts. Here's the terrifying question. What happens when the U.S. cannot pay? What happens when we reach stage 4 and require a bailout? Who bails out the country that prints the world's reserve currency? The answer? Nobody. The dollar collapses, reserve currency status vanishes, and the U.S. enters debt restructuring with international creditors. That restructuring will closely resemble what the IMF imposes on developing nations. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, the EU will demand concessions, control over strategic ports and infrastructure, ownership stakes in critical industries, territorial concessions or long-term asset leases, direct access to U.S. tax revenues ensuring debt repayment, an international debt administration similar to the Ottoman Empire's 1881 model, where foreign creditors collect U.S. taxes and transmit them directly to creditors. This sounds impossible, absurd, but it's exactly what occurred to every other country that crossed the debt threshold and couldn't pay. Economic sovereignty ends. Political sovereignty becomes meaningless. You become a debt colony flying your own flag. The timeline based on current trajectories. 2024 to 2027, stage 3 intensifies. Deficits remain above $2 trillion annually. Interest costs rise to $1.5 trillion, then $2 trillion yearly. Political paralysis prevents meaningful reform. 2027 to 2030, stage 4 begins. A failed treasury auction or major geopolitical crisis triggers confidence loss. Foreign creditors demand higher yields or cease buying altogether. The Fed is forced to monetize debt at massive scale. Dollar credibility shatters. 2030 to 2035, stage 5, debt restructuring. Some form of international debt conference where the global monetary system gets restructured and the U.S. is forced to accept foreign oversight of fiscal policy in exchange for continued credit access. This is the identical 5-stage pattern that's destroyed 152 developing nations, and we're in stage 3 right now.
So what do you actually do? How do you protect yourself when your own country walks into a debt trap? First, understand that the IMF model teaches us wealth flows from debtors to creditors. If you're a debtor, you're enslaved. If you're a creditor, you profit. Eliminate personal debt aggressively. The debt trap functions on individuals the same way it functions on nations. Second, position in hard assets maintaining value regardless of currency stability. Gold, silver, Bitcoin, productive real estate, anything that isn't merely a claim on someone's promise to pay. Third, build skills producing real value. The IMF pattern shows that when economies collapse, only people with tangible skills survive. Medical, agricultural, mechanical, construction, anything that can't be offshored or automated. Fourth, have international optionality. Don't keep 100% of assets in one jurisdiction. Diversify across countries and currencies. Fifth, watch the indicators. U.S. debt to GDP crossing 140%, danger zone. Failed treasury auction, crisis beginning. Creation of international fiscal oversight, sovereignty ending. Let me conclude with the core truth. The IMF is not a rescue organization. It's a debt enforcement mechanism, a financial colonization tool that's transferred $62 trillion from Earth's poorest countries to the wealthiest over 6 decades. It promises stability and delivers submission. It offers loans and demands sovereignty. And the pattern has never failed. 152 countries, same blueprint, same results. Debt, dependence, extraction. Now that same mechanism is being prepared for deployment against the United States because the mathematics doesn't care about military power, nuclear weapons, or historical exceptionalism. When you owe more than you can repay, you lose control. The creditors assume control. And the U.S. is $38 trillion in debt with no plan to stop borrowing. The trap is closing. Most Americans don't see it yet, but the developing world knows exactly what's coming because they've already experienced it. The question is whether you recognize the pattern before it's too late. If this revealed a system you didn't know existed, subscribe immediately and activate notifications. The next video covers the Chinese debt trap strategy through Belt and Road and how it's the same IMF playbook but executed faster with 21st century tools. You need to see it. The debt trap isn't theory. It's a proven weapon that's conquered 152 nations over 60 years, and it's targeting America next. The pattern is clear. The timeline is 5 to 10 years, and the only question is whether you prepare before the trap closes.